Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of Team Comp Tuesday. This week we are going to be looking at a variation of the Sunfire team, which is a team that I enjoy playing from time to time and do use sometimes because Jean is one of my favorite characters, at least visually, and a lot of her skills are cool and interesting, so I like to find excuses to play here. But of course, we're using one of the new 4 stars instead of, any of the pre-existing smart ways to build this team that we'll probably cover on a later week. But Layla just was added to the game, and she actually is an okay shieldish defensive option for this team, so I thought we'd do a video on it, and this gives me an excuse to play this team some more, as I haven't played it a ton recently since Dendro came out, and I've been mainly messing around with stuff like Dendro teams and stuff like that. But let's get to it. But before we go any further, I presume we should explain very quickly just what Sunfire is. Sunfire is essentially a term the community uses for infusing Jean's Burst with Pyro, traditionally applied by Bennet's Burst, as is one of the easiest ways to do it. As you can see, if I drop Benny's field and then drop the Jean field on top of it, the field quickly changes to Pyro, and it also pulses Pyro very quickly, and allowing you to trigger a ton of reactions in a very small period of time. This is used in some other teams and some other variants. For example, last week we used we did a burning video where we used Venti and Kazuha infused Pyro skills to use their EM. This allows you to put EM on a unit, on an emo units who traditionally want to be built with more EMG, not necessarily as much as others, but this allows you also to have your character that already has the Viridescent Venerer set on them be the one to trigger it, and just generally gives you decent damage output without having to either run a Pyro character that's built strictly for damage, or without having to build a whole bunch of EM, or being able to use someone who isn't a consistent Pyro applicator by using an Anemo swirl, or a consistent source of Anemo swirling, to constantly reapply reactions so that the Anemo character can instead trigger the reaction. We probably will visit some other teams in the future that use variations of this team. Stuff like, there are tons of different ways to use this in various different teams. Other Sunfire variants, which we'll go over at some point, but also stuff like using Electro Infusion on Anemo units to trigger Hyper Bloom instead of using traditional Electro units, as well as a couple other cases. So just a lot of stuff you can do once you start infusing Anemo skills with other elements, and it's a very easy way to trigger reactions without necessarily having to run characters that they themselves are super potent at triggering the reactions, so you can get other value out of these characters, whether they be buff characters or shield characters or something like that. But anyway, let's get into it. Alright, now let's go over the character builds. We're going to be starting off with the actual Sunfire core, so we're going to be starting with Jean. Now, contrary to standard Jean protocol, since you will be swirling and most of your damage is going to come from the triggered reactions off your swirl as well as the actual swirl damage itself, Elemental Mastery is the main stat you care about for your Jean. Weapons, free-to-play options, Iron Sting, also energy recharge weapons, not bad here since you do want to burst off cooldown, so especially if you don't have really good substats, you aren't insanely good at funneling, anything like that. Energy recharge weapons, not too bad here, stuff like Favonius, stuff like Festering Desire. If you have it, the Freedom Sworn is very good in this team for the team buffs for your allies. Iron Sting is generally what I tend to run, as I do not own a Festering Desire, and it is just a solid elemental mastery stat stick, as well as having a pretty okay effect for increasing your personal damage. Artifacts, important here is the Viridescent Veneer, as you will be swirling to get that damage reduction, as well as increasing the swirl damage. Very standard setup for VV sets: Elemental Mastery, Elemental Mastery, Elemental Mastery, with as much energy recharge as humanly possible to try to burst off cooldown. And for talents here, really the most important thing here is her level, since swirl damage based scales based off character level and elemental mastery. So honestly, her actual level is the most important thing here, but if you do care about skills, burst is pretty good, and you will be using Gale Blade to funnel energy, so I would recommend leveling up these two skills. Alright, now let's talk about the Pyro field we will be using, which is Benny. His is good because obviously it helps you buff the damage of the other characters in your party, as well as just being a very easy field for us to be able to swirl up with the Jean ultimate. Since if you don't know, Swirl actually has a priority rotation, so it'll prioritize Pyro first. So even if there's another element, a lot of times if you drop the Jean ult, it'll trigger on the Pyro even if there's another element sitting on top of it. Weapons, highest base attack weapon is the way to go. Aquila Favoni if you have it. Something like Black Cliff or Alley Slash. The new Sumeru craftable sword is actually probably your best option now, besides Aquila Favonia, as it has energy recharge as a substat and is a high base attack 4-star. I currently do not have one on my account. I haven't bothered to make one yet since I don't have a ton of need, since I just generally end up using Aquila. But I should probably make one, since a lot of times I do end up running something like Festering on Bennet, and it would be an upgrade over Festering, so I'll probably make one and level it soon. I know I've been talking a lot in these videos about that weapon, never actually had it to show off, but it is a very good weapon, and I would highly recommend getting it and investing into it if you can. Artifacts, Forset Noblesse here, just to buff the damage of your other party members. Stats, you have two options. You can either build for damage or you can build for pure healing. I personally like to build for damage, since you, especially on this team, you have double healers and a shielder, so you don't really need healing. So I got Crit Rate Circuit, Pyro Damage Goblet, Energy Recharge, Sands. Again, main goal is to have the burst up as much as possible, so if you can, a lot of energy recharge through your substats, especially if you're not running an energy recharge weapon. Talents, only one that really matters is his burst here. Level up as high as you can, and his E is kind of alright to put points into, as you will be spamming it, but it's not the end of the world if you don't want to level it. Also, side note, it generally isn't worth crowning the burst, as the attack ratio only goes up generally like here, mine 12 to 13, 7%, and a lot of times it's just more damage to spend the crown on the character whose damage you're trying to buff. So unless you're already in a situation where you've already done that, it's generally not worth it to waste to spend the crown here, but that's up to you and is neither here nor there. Alright, next up, let's talk about the cryo options in the team. I think first we're going to start with Layla, as she is kind of the inspiration for this team, and why I wanted to play it is I want an excuse to use her, and kind of right now this is kind of the main use I see for her is in a reverse melt team. And I want an excuse to play Sunfire, whereas I'm going to be completely honest, if you want the better version of this team, swap Jean for Zhangling and you're off to the races. But as I like Jean, I like excuses to play Jean. So Sunfire it is. So let's just talk briefly about Layla, what she does. She's essentially an off-field shielder that also does some cryo damage. She scales primarily or almost entirely based off HP. She's kind of a cross between Diona and Rosaria. She doesn't offer as much energy to cryo teams as a character like Diona, and she doesn't have healing. So if you actually want a defensive option or need energy, Diona tends to be better. And if you want a pure offensive option, someone like Rosaria tends to be better. But she is kind of a middle ground, and we can use her in teams like this where we want two off-field cryo units and just want some defensiveness. I really like her design. I really like the way she looks, so we found an excuse to use her. Side note, mine is level 70 of 80, and due to resource constraints, I'll probably not be leveling her up a ton more unless I find a really good home for her. But as she does scale with HP, and HP is one of the stats that increases a ton the more you level up the character, this is definitely a character I would consider getting to 90 of 90 if you intend to use her a ton. Weapons, I went Favonius Sword. There aren't really any HP scaling swords. There is the 5-star, the Key of whatever. That would be alright if you want to use that and you have that for some reason and don't need it. Otherwise, I would probably stick to Favonius. This gives her energy recharge to get her ult. This also gives her some party utility with the Windfall effect. If you're not using Favonius, I'd probably just use another energy recharge sword just so she can have her burst up more often. She kind of can scale with crit, and she is a shielder, so there is maybe an argument that something like Harbinger of Dawn is actually fine for her as well, just as a high crit stat stick. But Favonius is the way to go, in my opinion. Sets, Tenacity of the Millith is generally the way to go. It gives her HP scaling, gives her shield strength, and gives her a bit of buffing capabilities, which turns her from a pure defensive unit into giving her a little bit more offensive ability. Now, for artifacts, there's kind of a couple ways you can go, depending on whether you want to build her for some damage or some healing. I personally went straight HP across the board. But you definitely could do something like use a cryo damage goblet here to get more damage off, or possibly even a crit artifact here. But personally, considering one of the ways her damage application only works if her shield is up, I personally prefer to build her with as much HP as humanly possible, as even if you sack some damage, anytime she doesn't have her shield up, she's basically doing nothing. So I prefer to build full HP, trying to maintain that shield. Side notes, if you're using Favonius, try to get some crit rate from somewhere. I have pretty good substats, so I have like 32%, which is completely fine. But try to get somewhere in that 25 to 30 range if you can, so that you can actually proc your Favonius weapon a decent amount. And crit isn't bad on her, so definitely, you know, if you have to run a crit rate helmet to do it, just so you can consistently get that energy. Now for talents, you don't care about her normal attack. You want to level her E and her burst. These do actually have pretty good scaling, so it's probably honestly worth if you want to use your weekly mats on it. It's not the most awful thing in the world, as the shield does get rather large scaling. And on top of that, her abilities do scale entirely with HP, as we see here. There's no modifier for... Actually, there's a little bit of modifiers here for damage, but a lot of her stuff scales purely with HP, so that's why we mainly focus on HP for Layla. Overall, she's kind of a mid unit. She's definitely better than some of the other units we've gotten recently. Units like Dory, units like even Cole to a degree. But she kind of struggles to find a niche, as Cryo is probably one of the most oversaturated units. Her thing is she's like a slightly more offensive Diona that still has a shield, but she doesn't have the energy gen, which is actually kind of a problem. But she's a perfectly alright unit. She looks awesome. And she is pretty decent in this team. And pretty decent in any kind of like reverse melt setup team, especially ones that run low amounts of defensive units. And last but not least is Rosaria. I personally prefer Rosaria for this slot if you have some constellations on her. Kaya is competitive here, definitely, but Kaya constellations are harder to get. And especially once you have this C2 here, giving Rosaria's ult a lot longer time. She tends to generally beat out Kaya in teams where both of them are usable. I also just prefer her. She's cool. I like excuses to use Rosaria. Her skills look awesome. And the crit rate that she gives to your allies is not a non-factor. Now for weapons, any kind of standard damage weapon works here. Crit rate weapon, deathmatch, Blackcliff, any 5-star with crit rate or crit damage on it, perfectly fine. The catch actually not too bad of an option here either, since she is mainly burst damage reliant. You generally don't need the energy recharge, especially in a double cryo team, but especially in like a single cryo team, this weapon pretty good. This spear actually not too bad either, since sometimes she will grab a melt or something, so having that little bit of elemental mastery, not too bad. Wavebreaker's Fin probably also not too bad in this team, since I believe every unit's burst is actually rather high costing, so not that bad. Personally, I just use Deathmatch because it's what I have. Artifacts, you have a couple options here. We won't be freezing, so you don't really care about the 4-piece Blizzard Strayer, but any combination of 2-piece Blizzard Strayer and 2-piece attack sets is fine. 4-piece Emblem could be okay. Generally, she doesn't need that much energy to recharge, so generally better to go with attack. 2-piece Noblesse, just whatever you have the best substats on is the way to go. Very standard build, crit rate or crit damage on the Circlet, cryo damage on the Goblet, and a attack on the Sands. For talents, you're mainly just worried about her E and her burst. Definitely if you want to prioritize one, the burst is a larger chunk of the team's damage, so that is worth investing into over the skill, but the skill is still nice to level up. Alright, now it's time for the sample rotation. So generally what I like to do is cast Layla's stuff, since it doesn't really care about attack, then cast Bennet's stuff, then Rosaria's stuff, and then swirl the ults. And then we just rotate through our characters, casting our skills and bursts, just to build back up to our kind of nuke phase, for lack of a better term. Remember to go on Layla to proc your Favonius weapon. And there we go. We didn't even get to a second Jean burst. So as you see, the team actually does do quite a bit of damage, surprisingly. And the main thing there is you just want to make sure you're lining up your important skills like Rosaria's burst with your buffs. So you want to make sure you have your Bennet ult down and have your Layla buffs up and running, so you have both of your attack buffs going before you cast your Rosaria stuff. And your Jean burst, especially since you have a pretty long time on the Bennet field before you need to worry about the laying down the Jean field, because even if you cast the last, catch the last second and a half, as long as it infuses the Jean field, you're completely fine and it'll work. Alright, that's going to be this week's episode of Team Comp Tuesday. I want to thank you all for coming out for the I think I'm gonna call this team something like Sleepy Sunfire. That sounds like a good name, Sleepy Sunfire. And yeah, it was nice to get to use one of the new 4-stars in an actually pretty okay, pretty decent team, and it was fun to use one of my old favorite characters in a team. Of course, Bennet carries as every team he does, but that's neither here nor there. I want to thank you for coming out. I hope you have a great day and good luck on the Skara and Ito banner. Or no, it's not Skara. Yeah, Skara and Ito banners, which are coming out soon. In general, just really briefly, if you want to roll on them, be my guest. But in general, if you don't care about Skara or Ito, these banners are some of the easiest skips to ever exist. Also, Farazan, not really that good if you don't have her at C6, even for characters like Scaramouche, so kind of not too pleased about that personally, but whatever. Next week will probably be a Scaramouche episode, unless I decide to not roll him. Right now I'm like 95% sure I'm rolling him, but there's still slim chance that I might not and save for units like Alhytham and Deja. But we'll see, we'll see. Thanks for coming out, and I hope you have a great day.